Thank you very much, Ken. I appreciate that introduction. And also thank you, Aten, for the ability to share a little bit about configuration management in Drupal today. I'm very excited to talk about this topic. Now, in particular, this topic means a lot to me because it solves some of the biggest problems I've had with Drupal, but also configuration management systems over the years. But before we get into some of this, can you please share the poll that we created? There's just a quick little poll so that I can kind of see from the people who are here today what sort of experience you might have with configuration management already. Based on your answers of the group, I'll try to contextualize the presentation a little bit and make it a little more technical or a little more basic or go into more detail in certain areas if that's helpful. And while we're waiting for that, I'll go ahead and do an introduction as well. Hello again, my name is David Needham. I'm a developer advocate at Pantheon. I like to say that I sit between the developers that are actively creating all the functionality at Pantheon, all of the Drupal and WordPress hosting and agile tools and all those different things related to helping your web ops team work in a way that's really agile and performant. But I sit between those developers that are working on Pantheon and making it better and the developers that are actively using Pantheon. So I usually spend a lot of time out in the Drupal and WordPress communities and other open source tech communities, presenting and trying to help organize and volunteering my time to do everything I can to be present and useful and helpful in those spaces. And then everything I learned there, I take back to Pantheon so that we are, as a company, functioning in a way that's really useful and helpful for our customers. All right, so looking at the poll results, I'm seeing we have the majority of folks are leaning towards the have never used configuration management before. Maybe you've heard a little bit about it. Some of you haven't heard about it before, and that's okay. That is really helpful. So for this presentation, we start at the very basics. In fact, to start at the absolute most basic, let's start by talking about the anatomy of a content management system. Now, we're going to be using Drupal today, of course, because we're talking about Drupal's configuration management. However, this is true. This anatomy is descriptive of WordPress or Joomla or other configuration management systems out there that you've already used. So any any content management system out there has really 3 different parts to it that make up the entire system. So the first one is code. This is the PHP or whatever is under the hood, running your Drupal modules and your themes and all of those other things. Those are all in the code. We also have configuration. These are the things that you do when you click buttons in the interface. For Drupal, maybe you're creating content types, maybe you're creating fields, maybe you're creating dynamic lists and views, and you're typing something into a box and you're clicking save. That is configuration. And then we also have content, which could be any of the types of content you might have on your website. Maybe they're articles or basic pages. Who knows? It could be anything. But it could also include things like products if you have a store. It could include customers if you have a store or something like that, or individual user accounts as well. And the important thing to take away from this is that when you're working with your CMS, when you're working with Drupal, you probably aren't working just on a single server. You're not just working on the live environment and doing your development there, because that is pretty widely accepted as a bad practice because it's risky. You might break something or lose something and then your website goes down, and that is not a good idea. You always want to be working in at least a development environment, but maybe others, maybe you're working locally. But part of the problem with this becomes like, when you take a website from your live environment and you want to copy it down to another environment, you have, again, 3 parts that you have to manage. The first one is code, and code is pretty self-explanatory, but there's also the database. With Drupal, it might be MariaDB or MySQL. It could be something else entirely, but you have a database that has all that information in it. And then you also have a files directory. And in Drupal space and in WordPress space, this is referring to those content files that get created when you create content. You upload a PDF, you upload an image to go on your article. Those are files as far as it's concerned. And so each one of these pieces, the code, configuration, and content, map directly over to the code, database, and files. And the first one is pretty easy. Code is code. Hopefully you're using some form of version control. Git, for example, is probably the most popular these days. And that helps you keep track of your code and make sure that you can roll back if anything goes wrong. Now, configuration is actually saved in the database. So when you, again, click that save button on some configuration page, you are saving all of that information in the database, and the database is where your Drupal site is actually looking for what color am I supposed to make this this thing over this theme, or what text is supposed to appear on the title of the website. Well, it looks to the database, it queries, it gets that information, and that is how that's saved. The content, though, is a little bit tricky because some of the content is the actual content, the words in your article and things like that. Those get saved in the database, but then we also have those content files that you've uploaded, and so those get kind of mapped together as well. And so as you start to think about moving your site from your live environment to your local environment, or from live to a development environment, you have to manage code, database, and files. And so the historical best practice way of doing this, and this is something I heard for any web application over 10 years ago, this was seen as like the best practice, was using at least 3 environments. You have dev, you have test, and you have live. And I'll admit upfront, full disclosure, it's no coincidence that this is the same structure as Pantheon. When Pantheon started not quite 10 years ago, we founded with all of these best practices in mind and these workflows in mind to make it easy. However, this is not a presentation about Pantheon, even though I'm sort of demonstrating it here, even though the live demo later on uses some Pantheon in it to demonstrate how things are working. You should be able to apply these configuration management techniques to just about any other place that you might have your site saved at the moment. So no big deal. But let's get back to the point here. We have a development workflow. We have these 3 environments. The live environment might be self-explanatory. That's where you connect your domain. It's where people are actively interacting with your website. So people are visiting your site, buying things from your store. The content creators are logging in and creating content. All of that information is being saved and interacting on the live environment. Now, we also have a dev environment, and that's usually where you have your developers and other people on your web ops team interacting with your website to do updates. Drupal comes out with regular security updates, often on Wednesdays, so those need to be applied. You do that in the dev environment. There might also be new functionality over time. You might also be fixing bugs or improving the theme. I mean, it could be anything. All of that code work is happening in the dev environment. And then we also have the test environment. The test environment becomes the place where these 2 pieces come together so that you can test your website and make sure it's working before you actually need to push it up to live. So in practice, it usually works by, you're working in dev, you're kind of getting all your stuff ready to go. When you think that you're done with your updates or your new feature or whatever it is in dev, and you're saying, okay, I'm ready to push this up to live, you start by refreshing your test environment. You sync your database and files. You're effectively making a copy of live, making that your test environment so that you can deploy your code from dev to test. And at that point, you're effectively deploying all of those code changes, all those configuration, all of that new features, all those security updates that you did in dev into a copy of live, so that if there's anything that breaks, there's no risk. It's all totally fine. You can go back to dev, rework it, redeploy, and you didn't risk taking the website down at all because the code never even made it up to the live environment. So anyway, so once you've moved it to test, maybe you've set up your automated tests, you've gotten your project manager approval or your customer approval to push it up to live. So then you deploy your code up to live. And once this development cycle is done, you could refresh the dev environment by copying your files, again, your content files and your database from live down to your dev environment. And this resets your dev environment so that your next development cycle has all of the most recent content and other changes that have happened in live. And as I said, this workflow has been seen as the best practice way of doing it for quite a long time. But there is a problem. There's actually a couple of problems. But the biggest problem that's always been present for me is, what about configuration? I mentioned earlier, well, configuration is not really something you want to do on live. Now, it's potentially risky to change things that would be in configuration on your live site. So you want to do that in dev, but you might notice that the database and files originate in the live environment and they sync down. You don't want to overwrite the database and files in your live environment, going from like test to live or to dev to live, because then you might overwrite the content and all of that work that people have been doing, all of your customer data and checkout data that's been happening in the live environment since the last time you refreshed your dev environment. So that's a problem. Well, historically, I might have used the features module, but more than likely, I would have just done my work more than once. I would have done all of my configuration in dev, and then I'd refresh my test environment, and I'd do all of that work again to click buttons in the interface and click save, and yes, okay, it worked. And then once it's all worked, I would then go to live and I'd click all those buttons again. So I would do my work 3 times for every configuration change I make. I mentioned there's a features module that got a little bit better, and maybe at the end we can talk a little bit more about the features module and how it's a little bit different. But this process of having to do your content or your configuration more than once is pretty demoralizing, right? Like nobody wants to have to do any work more than once. If you've ever, I'm sure all of you at some point have been typing into a box and then something happens and all of a sudden all that work is gone. You have to type it all again, or coding, someone overwrites your work and you have to do that again. It's just so demoralizing to have to do something like this more than once. And it leads to you being a little bit lazy, or at least it led to me being a little bit lazy, where I start to wonder, man, like, do I really need to do this in the test environment? Can't I just do it in dev and then do it in live and be done? Like, why do I need to do that? And so that's not good, right? And also it can lead to making mistakes. The more times you have to repeat an action like this, the more likely it is that you're going to do something that actually breaks the site along the way. And a more senior developer than me could certainly write code to do some of this. You could write a script that would export only the parts of the database that you care about, import those specific parts into the live environment. That is beyond me. I've seen people do it. I know it works. It scares me a little bit. I mostly identify as more of a site builder that can do a little bit of the PHP and development and theming if I need to. But the site building space is where the configuration management system actually lives. So it's much more approachable for everyone. But the problem here, if we switch back to that anatomy, is that configuration is tied to the database. Because configuration is part of the database, we can't move the database, overwrite the live environment, so we can't move configuration up. Well, part of what we're doing with Drupal's configuration management system is actually moving the database into code. Now that there's a clean split between what is code and what is the other piece, we're able to actually move our configuration with our code, all of that work that we've done in dev, deploy that up to test, deploy that up to live, and it's not as big of a deal anymore. We don't have to pick and choose the bits that we want. So in practice, it actually looks a little bit like this. We have our dev environment, we make changes, we're adding some new piece of functionality, let's say. As part of this process, Drupal is still reading from the database, and we've been making those changes there, so we're actually changing the database, but we want to export that config. And so we click the button in the interface to export config, and that saves all of that configuration that we've done as code, as they're actually YAML files that you can read and pretty much understand what it's doing when it exports that there. Once you have it in code, you can then deploy your code to your other environments. You can use version control and make commits. You can do that deployment and push it up to your test environment. And then once it's there, you can import your config. So again, Drupal is only reading from the database, but on the test environment, you can say, okay, import config. It looks at your code, it compares the two, it overwrites the database with the changes that are in your config files, and then you can verify that everything worked. Once you're satisfied, deploy it to live, do the import again, and you're golden. And that entire process is so much faster and so much easier for a regular person like myself to be able to jump in and do without writing any code or do anything like that. So now, if we take a look at the development workflow again, it's pretty similar. We still have dev test live, and that's cool. But now, as part of the process, with our development cycle, we are routinely exporting configuration. As we're going along through our development cycle, we're exporting config, and we're committing that, we're exporting config and committing that. We're just doing that whenever we feel like we want to take a snapshot of our configuration work. Then, once we're ready to deploy, we sync up the files and database to the test environment, recreating it from scratch. We deploy all those code changes up to test. We then import the config. so that now our config on test matches all the work that we did in dev, and then we just do the same thing for live. And it's no surprises on live. We've already seen it all in test, so everything's going to work because we've verified that it's all going to work. And then you can sync your database and files back down. So naturally, you might already be thinking this, there are lots of benefits to doing something like this, to using the built-in configuration management system. First of all, you can actually move your configuration. You can save it in version control, you can deploy these changes and move it with code anytime that you add these modules. So if you add a new module, and you go through and you enable it, and then you use that module to build out things, you can actually export your config and bundle it and kind of keep it as one unit to move up to live. And that's much, much easier to work with. And it's so much easier if you need to roll something back, because it's not part database, part code, it's all in code, which is huge. Also, you get to version control your configuration. This is probably the most significant piece here, because, like I said earlier, nobody wants their stuff to be overwritten, right? Well, who has ever done some sort of thing on the site, and then you check back a week later and it's broken again? Like, either it's your customer or a coworker or who knows, a colleague, I don't know. You did something, you fixed it, and now it's broken again. And you're like, man, what happened? How did that break again? Or why is it now like this when I did it like that? Well, because configuration is now saved in code. If you're using Git or another version control system, then you can actually see exactly when that configuration changed. And if you want to overwrite it or roll back to a previous state, it is super easy to do that. This is also really helpful if you work with customers on a regular basis who break their site and they're like, help, we broke it, please come and fix it for us. Well, if you're saving all of your configuration in code, it's so much easier to reset it back. All right, also you can rebuild the dev environment anytime. So for the site builders out there, for the people that are content creators and interacting with your site, this may not mean such a big thing. However, as a developer who is routinely building out and coding things on the dev environment, you want to keep that environment in sync with live as much as possible so that you are not developing something that's going to eventually break. You're able to kind of catch things before they become problems by seeing all the content that's coming in on live and making sure that everything's going to work in your dev environment. Well, usually that happens at the very end of the development cycle because you don't want to overwrite all the changes you've been making in the dev environment. Well, by using configuration management, you're able to just take a commit, export all of your configuration whenever you want. You could then sync up your database and files from live at any time, re-import in the dev environment, and you're right back to where you were. So you didn't lose any of your progress, and you get to sync up right away, which also can be really beneficial as you're going along. And then finally, you can also automate. So if you don't want to go in through the interface with Drupal, you don't want to click the buttons, you don't have to. You can use Drush. You can run a command line tool to interact with your site that way and to export and import your configuration. And then if you want it to automatically import your configuration somewhere else, not a big deal. You can actually have a script set up to auto import your configuration and test and then on live. So you don't have to click the extra buttons to do that manually. There are some gotchas though. There's some things you should know and be aware of as you're going through. It does only work on one site at a time, and this is intentional. If you want to learn more about this, the original team back at DrupalCon Austin were presenting on this and talked about why they chose this. I will have a link to the slides later on if you want to, actually I'll just throw it in now. If you want to check it out, you can click that link by checking out my slides. Also, it is worth noting that you really need to communicate with your team. If you are on a team of people working on a website, or if the customer is actually sometimes interacting with configuration, you want to be in communication with them about how this process works. Because when you import configuration and test and you import it in live, you are overwriting what's in the database, in the configuration section of the database, with all of the work that you've done somewhere else. So if somebody changes something in test and they're not expecting it to be imported later on, all of the work that they did just then is going to be lost. But again, it's not seen as a best practice to do configuration like that in your test or your live environments. You should do that in dev because it's the right way to do it. However, there are some modules I'll talk about in just a minute that will help if there is something you need to change in a different environment. Also, there is some ambiguity around if certain things are content or configuration. For example, Drupal blocks, a block that you put in the sidebar of your website that pretty much never changes. That sounds a little bit more like configuration, but a block that you put on the sidebar of a blog post, maybe as like an aside with a few more things, like that sounds more like content. By default, Drupal's configuration management system doesn't deal with that. And again, there are modules and things you can add to make that a little bit clearer. And then also the taxonomy system, the menu system, I mean, that applies to all of those areas where it doesn't quite handle those by default because it is ambiguous if it's content or configuration. So there are modules you can add that will help. Speaking of modules, my most favorite module for configuration management system on Drupal is the config direct save module. What this module does is it makes the configuration management system work like I think it should work. Basically, as you go in, you say, I am ready to export my configuration. So by default, what Drupal does is you click export and it downloads a gzipped tar file, a compressed file of all of my configuration. And then if I want to put that into my code, I immediately switch over to the import screen. I click upload and I re-upload that gzipped tar file to put all of that code in place in the Drupal site so it can read from it in the future. That seems a little annoying, right? It's not intuitive, and like downloading and uploading, right? It just seems really strange. Well, the config direct save module gives you another option, a sync option, where all that you do is click the button and it just puts it into your code folder where it's supposed to go for configuration. So you don't have to download anything, you just click the button, it syncs it to code, and then you commit, deploy, you're on your way. Configuration read-only mode is a wonderful module if you want to make something read-only. So this allows you to do things like lock down a live environment. So you could say no configuration is allowed or only certain configuration is allowed on the live environment. This helps keep people from getting a little bit frustrated if you're overwriting work during an import. This will make it so the UI doesn't let them change configuration, which can be really helpful for making sure they don't break the site, but also making sure their work isn't overwritten when you make a change. Another one is config ignore. There are certain scenarios where you don't want configuration that you've done in dev to end up on live, or configuration you've done locally that you don't want to end up on live. For example, it's usually seen as a best practice to keep the UI modules disabled from the live environment, from the production environment, for performance reasons. So like the views UI module, for example, is something I usually have enabled on dev because I'm interacting with views there. But if I'm not doing configuration on live, I don't need it there. However, if I enable it on dev and I'm routinely doing config exports, eventually it's going to happen. I'm going to forget to disable it, or it's just annoying to have to re-enable, disable all the time. So I can just set a config ignore to say, no longer worry about exporting the enabling of the views UI module. Ignore that configuration and it won't end up on live and accidentally enabled on the live environment. And then the last one here is probably one of the more complex ones, but it's a scenario where you want to have different configuration for different scenarios. Maybe you have multiple sites that you want to use the same configuration, or you want a totally different setup for local versus live or something else. And there is actually, the folks at Aten are in the process of writing a blog post, I've been told, and we'll be publishing that later on. So we'll be able to learn a little bit more about config split. It's actually a module I haven't had a chance to use a whole lot, but there are a bunch of extra modules that refer to this one that kind of sit on top. So it seems like it can add a lot more power to your configuration management if you do need a little bit more than what you can do out of the box. All right. There is also CLI and automation. I mentioned earlier that you can use Drush as one of the benefits. So just a Drush config export, Drush config import will let you interact with your site and do those import and exports. It does simplify that little like workflow diagram here because you only have to export in the dev environment, and with automation, you can then have it automatically import your config whenever you deploy to test and whenever you deploy to live. And this is important because if you want automated testing on your website, then you're going to need a script like this to import your configuration. Otherwise, the test is going to run before you have a chance to actually log in and import configuration. So the test isn't going to include all that work that you did on the config up to that point. So adding some sort of a quick little script to auto import on deploy will be really important if you're doing automated testing. All right, so I think we're ready for a live demo. So I am joined today by the editor-in-chief of Umami Magazine. Let me actually just go get him real quick. His name is Mr. Jenkins, and I'm sorry to say he's a little stuck up isn't the right word, but he asked me to actually make him a green room. So I've had to like put some snacks, a little bit of hummus and chips and things like that, as well as some few collection of LaCroix, because he's very particular about that stuff. But anyway, I'm gonna get him from the green room, and here he goes, joining me on stage now, Mr. Jenkins. Hello, everybody. My name is Mr. Jenkins, and I am the editor of Umami Magazine. It's a very prestigious magazine about food. I agreed to help David with this presentation today because with everything that's going on in the world right now, we think it's important to be transparent, to show how we are creating this wonderful content about food on the Umami Food Magazine website. So I have an article that I've written that I'm prepared to publish live on this presentation to show you exactly how we do it. So if I go to content, I'm going to go after that over to add new content to my website. It's a really wonderful article about oatmeal. I love oatmeal. It is my most favorite grain. So I go to article. I'm going to go into the title, and I titled this wonderful article, Eat More Oatmeal. And I don't want to bore you with the process of writing the post live on the air, so I wrote it in advance. I'm going to just paste that in. All right, now let's provide an image. I have prepared a wonderful image with oatmeal, of course. And since I'm the editor, I have the ability to just publish this live. So let's change this to published and click save. So here we go. Eat more oatmeal, and you should eat more oatmeal. Looks great. Now, if I go to the articles page, well, we do have more than one article. This appears to be a problem. We have this from time to time, and I don't know why, but I need to call our developer. One moment, I'll get Kyle on the phone and see if he can jump in and join us. One moment, please. Hello, Kyle. Yeah, the articles page is broken again. Can you join us, please? All right, thank you. Well, howdy, folks. My name is Kyle, and I am the developer for Umami Magazine. Now, my boss, Mr. Jenkins, just called me in because it seems like we're having some sort of an issue on the articles page, and he left his window up so I can see it right here. Yep, the articles page is only showing one item, which is bizarre because we usually see 6 items on this page. Well, that's okay. That's why I make the big bucks here at Umami Magazine. I'm just going to jump over to my site and take a look. So I am on a Pantheon site, so I can see I'm currently in the development environment. And if I take a look at this development environment, I can see if this is actually broken here too. I'm logged in with my developer account. Now, if I go over to articles for this site, and again, let me exit full screen. I can confirm I'm in the dev environment because it starts with dev up here. This is not the live environment. If I go over to the articles page, I can confirm, well, I don't see Mr. Jenkins' new and I'm sure wonderful article about oatmeal, but I do see this previous article he wrote, and there is only one item. All right, well, I think I can fix this pretty easily, but I'm going to do it here in the dev environment. So if I go in I suspect this is probably some sort of a problem with the view. We do occasionally have some problems with this, but if I go in and edit the view for the articles page, I can see pretty quickly if it is broke. Yep, I can see it already. So right here under the pager, it currently says display a specified number of items, 1 item. So if I need to fix this, I just need to put it back on full pager, click apply. I want to see 6 items per page, click apply, and then I'm going to click save. All right, very good. So this has been fixed. So what I want to do now is actually export my configuration. Now, if I go to the configuration tab at the top of this Drupal website, I can go down to the configuration synchronization page, which has a lot more information about how to interact with my site's configuration. Now, I do see immediately, it tells me that there is one thing changed. Because Drupal reads from the database actively, that's where all that configuration gets saved, it can detect whenever there's a change between my database and the code, all of the configuration that's been exported previously. So I can actually just come right in here, click on View Differences, and it's going to show me a git diff of what exactly has changed between the two. So I can see it used to be some items per page 1, and we've changed it to a full pager with 6 items. So this is correct. This is what it should be. So if I click import all, you might think that's a good idea. That's actually not going to work, because if we import, that's going to look at our configuration code, the things we've exported in the past, and overwrite our live database with that, which the database is currently correct. We want to export our code. But if we go over to this export tab, this is going to download a gzip tar file, which I then have to immediately import, which is kind of silly. So if we go over to this update tab, this is new with the config direct save module. It's a wonderful module. We can just come in here, choose sync, update configuration, and now it is actually saving this out to our site. So it's to our code directly. We don't have to download and upload. We just click the button and it's good to go. Alrighty. So I think we're done in the dev environment. If I close this out, let me refresh my environment. Oh, I can see right there. It says one change is ready to commit in my development environment. So again, we're using Pantheon for this. It's great for illustrating exactly and seeing what's happening, but this is true for any place that you might be having your Drupal site. I'm just gonna check this out. I can see that diff if I wanna click on this and get that again, but we already saw that in the UI. We don't need to do that. So now if I click on add a commit message, we're gonna say fixing the number of articles on the articles page. Let me click on commit. So now we'll just wait a minute for this fix to be committed. While we're waiting, I'm actually going to jump over to my test environment and click on visit test site. This is the place where we're going to be testing. We don't want to risk breaking or making the live site even worse. So we're going to do all of our work here. Oopsie. We're going to do all of our work here in the test environment instead. Let me just confirm that it's broken there. It's probably fine. If we go into to articles, yes, it's still broken, which is fine. Now, back over on the Pantheon side in my test environment, I can see that there is now that commit that we made in dev is ready to go up to your test environment. And I can write in a deploy log message. I can also say pull files and database from the live environment. This is the magic piece right here, because what this does is it actually copies that new article, that content that Mr. Jenkins made previously up in the live environment, and it copies that down, creates a new test environment for us with all of that content in it, so that when we deploy our code up, we know exactly what's going to happen. If it totally breaks the site, we didn't just break live. We can go back to dev and refix it and redeploy it, and then have another chance to get it working again. Let me tell you, this has saved my bacon more than once. Now, once this is done deploying and actually doing the files and database sync up and the code deploy back, then we are going to be able to check out this test environment again, and we can actually jump in and import our configuration. So in this case, you can see up here in the workflows tab, it is still going, though it is almost done. Now, it looks like it just finished. If I refresh on the test environment, it is almost ready to go. Looks like it's still spinning after all. What this is saying right here is basically the database recently got refreshed and it's doing its thing to sync up from the live environment. All righty. Refresh one more time. All righty, so there we go. We're on the test environment. Let me confirm that it is still broken. And hey, it is broken, but now we get that piece of content. We got that Eat More Oatmeal article that Mr. Jenkins created. So I'm just gonna log in right here with my developer account. And once I'm logged in, I'll be able to go into my configuration synchronization section up here at the top. Right here, configuration synchronization. Very good. And now if I can view differences, but now I actually want to import. Remember, Drupal is always reading from the database. This import is going to look at our code and overwrite the database with all of the configuration changes we made up to this point. Because this is the test environment, this has all the configuration we did in dev. So this import button is absolutely what we want to do right now. This is going to overwrite the active database with all those changes that we had already fixed in dev previously. Should just take a second to complete that operation. Once it is done, all we have to do is go back to our site. We can go back to the articles page and drum roll, yeah. So we have all of the articles showing up and we see that new content. So the content and that configuration got mixed together here in the test environment, so I can confirm that it's all gonna work. This is now how live is gonna work once we deploy our code up from our test environment. But again, this process right now that Mr. Jenkins is happy and we're good to go, we can get approval, we can run our automated tests, which actually, to prevent this next time, we might want to think about adding in some automated tests. But for now, since we're in the middle of a presentation, I'm just going to go ahead and deploy this change to live. And of course, we will need to redeploy or re-import our configuration in this environment. I could set up a script to handle that for me. But while we're waiting for this to complete, you might be asking yourself, well, you know, Kyle, who broke the page? Well, I'm a little bit ashamed to say it, but I might have broke the page. I'm the only developer on this project, so it's probably going to be me. But let's look. If you were curious about who exactly might have broke your configuration, since we're using Git version control, it's actually not all that complicated. We have this Git that you can use to actually look at a particular file and see when it was changed, what commit, so you can see like when it happened and who made that change itself. So if we go into sites default config, and this is my command line locally now, if we cd into sites default config, and then if we do a git log dash lowercase p, and then we call the, what is it called again? Views view featured article. Yeah, there we go, just like that. So if I do git log dash p dash dash, the name of the file that we actually want to check on, then we can open that up and we can see right away there is a temporary change to try and fix article spacing issues. Now I did that back in July. Well, actually, David did this back in July, but you get my point, right? We can see exactly who changed this file, when it changed, and exactly what it was changed from and to. So another solution could have been actually, instead of fixing it again, doing this in the first place and then just reverting this commit, rolling it back, and then you'd be good to go. But anyway, I think that pretty much wraps it up for this presentation. Now, we do have this ready to go in live. I just have to re-import, and I could use Drush for that, but it's pretty easy going from here on out. So I'm going to go ahead and say goodbye, and I'm going to hand the mic now back to David, who will finish out the Q&A and anything else we might have left. So I'll see you all next time. All right. Well, I hope that was helpful and interesting for you today. I always have a lot of fun doing this presentation and being able to invite Kyle and Mr. Jenkins to the stage to present. It's a lot of fun. It keeps it interesting, hopefully a little bit entertaining for you as well. But yeah, let's keep on moving. So there are some more resources if you are interested in configuration management, you want to keep learning. There's lots of ways that you can dig in deeper into this topic. Drupal has a really wonderful CFM guide, and you can check out, again, the slides. I'll post a link in the chat if you want to grab the slides so you can grab these yourself and click the links. Or I see Joe has been very helpfully putting links in the chat too. That is awesome. So the CFM guide, the configuration management guide from Drupal.org directly is very helpful in explaining exactly how to get started. Also, Drupalize.me is a really wonderful video training service. They have a really great configuration management video series if you prefer to learn via video. Then also there is the article, Drupal 8 Configuration Management, Solving the Configuration Conundrum, which was actually written by my friends in Chicago from Chromatic. It's a different agency, but they wrote this article, which I think does a really excellent job of illustrating the problem. It's a rather long article, but it goes through some of the points that I talked about earlier of what the problem is with the space and how configuration management in Drupal absolutely solves the issue that they had with their day-to-day development. And then finally, Pantheon also does have some articles and docs on this. The configuration workflow for Drupal 8 sites is over on our docs, and you can go check that out as well. And with that, I see we have a few minutes left for questions, so I will just formally thank you all very much for listening to me and Kyle and Mr. Jenkins today. If you do have any questions, feel free to ask them in the chat right now. You can also reach out to me directly on Twitter at David Needham or on any of the Slacks or email or whatever you would like. But yeah, I'll hand the mic now back to Kenna so we can get some questions.
Perfect, David. Thank you so much. I can honestly say that's probably the most fun webinar we've hosted yet, and some great guest stars. Also, I want to remind everybody before we start answering the questions that we have already to feel free to drop some in the Q&A if you have anything or if anything comes up as we're answering questions, especially if you have questions for Kyle or Mr. Jenkins. I'm sure they'd be glad to answer. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. David, I got that first question for you, and it is, why would a developer use Drupal configuration management instead of the features module?
Yeah, great question. So the features module was created way back with maybe the end of Drupal 6, like sometime, it's been around for quite a while, but the problem that the features module was created to solve was building out functionality and then transporting that functionality to a different site. So if you build out a really killer blog on your website and you want to use that blog functionality on a totally different site, features lets you export that piece and pick it up and drop it somewhere else. When the community discovered that, oh, wow, we could actually use that for configuration management as well, it kind of got blown out of proportion a little bit. Like we could use it for configuration management, but because it wasn't really intended for that, you ended up with these really wacky issues happening sometimes, like lots of false negatives and false positives, things working or not working for reasons that make no sense whatsoever. It worked, and it was the best option, all the way through Drupal 7, but it was a real pain to work with. But again, it was kind of the best we had. When Drupal 8 came out, it launched with configuration management, and because it's all built into core, it was developed from way back when Drupal 7 was first announced as something that's built in core to be compatible and to work well. And from my experience and from the folks I've talked to, it has been super reliable and a really great system for actually doing configuration management. Now, the features module does still exist, and it is still a good option if you are trying to use it for its original purpose of taking one piece of functionality and move it to a different site.
Perfect. And I hope that helped whoever asked that question. If you have any more questions, please drop it in the Q&A. The next question we have for you, David, is when configuration is deployed on Pantheon, is it automatically deployed, or do I have to manually import configuration?
So there is not so because configuration management requires communication with your team, and because importing configuration does lose configuration that people, it overwrites the database to do configuration. We as Pantheon cannot make that an automatic thing. Like, it'd be cool if it was a checkbox or something, like to be an option. But no, it doesn't do it automatically, not out of the box. However, there is a very simple, on Pantheon, you can write what we call Quicksilver scripts that let you fire off scripts in response to workflows that are happening in the dashboard. So you could say, after deployment to live or test, drush import, drush config import, and it will then say complete the process of deploying your code and then immediately do a drush import. And that way, if you're then going on to do automated testing, you're taken care of and it's all good to go. And actually, I'll find that the docs page for this. We actually have some of that all kind of something you can just drop into your site pretty much. So we can go ahead and take the next question, and I'll grab a link and throw that in the chat in a minute.
Perfect. All right, so the next question we have for you, David, is, can you say more about the kinds of things you need to communicate with the team? What situations should I watch out for to avoid problems? Great question.
Yeah, that is a really great question. I think it really comes down to, I think that the issues that I mentioned are the biggest thing. Like, nobody likes their work to be overwritten. If you don't communicate about what configuration, the configuration management system is and how it's working, the import and export process, at least with your team, then it can be really frustrating and confusing because, like, my changes on test or my changes on live got overwritten again. Like, why is this happening? Like, that's a situation that nobody likes to be in. And as a customer who might be even less technical, it can be good to have those conversations with them too, explaining, for best practice reasons, why these changes are working this way and why it might be in their best interest to do like read-only mode in your live environment so that those configuration changes can't be changed by them and they can't accidentally break something or have something overwritten. I think those are the most important parts, is just understanding that things will be lost, or things will be overwritten if you don't do it in the right way. And if you add in the automation piece, for Pantheon, the Quicksilver script that automatically imports your configuration, then that's also something you should communicate, because that is automatically doing it. There's no like, hey, deploy the code, but hey, don't import configuration yet, it's not ready. Like, it's automatic. So that's another important thing to talk about.
Perfect.
And I found the script, so I'm just putting that in the chat. You can go check that out, and there are instructions on that page with all the code that you need, and also steps to add it to your site.
Perfect. Bon, I hope that answered your question, and if something else comes up, feel free to reach out to us or David directly, and we'll get that set up for you. Do we have any more questions from anybody before we jump off? Looks like we got one more question from Vaughn. If I'm collaborating with other developers, do we export/import the whole config and let JIT take care of it? Or do we export just a single thing one at a time?
Yeah, so everything. I think in the early days it wasn't clear. I think some people did like individual things and some people did everything. Nowadays, and I can be corrected, but like in all of the work that I've been doing in the last 3 years or so, it's pretty much always been export everything, probably at the beginning of your project, and then going forward, you just always export everything, basically. But in the process of exporting, it is only generating new files for the things that have changed, and so Git is able to keep track of that. And if I change configuration in one space, and my coworker changes configuration on another section of the site entirely, and then we both kind of merge our code together, Git is able to negotiate that and do that merge together, because the files are pretty granular. Like the sections of the website are broken out. You notice that that code file that I was looking at in Git, like it's views view, and then there's a section, there's a view named featured articles. So there is a separate configuration file generated for every single view, and for every single like block, or every single, that's maybe a bad example, but like there's configuration for an extremely large number of items. And because it's so granular, the process of merging changes from multiple developers is usually not that big of a deal. And if it is a big deal, then that means you probably changed the same configuration in different ways, and that's something you should talk about. So it's leading to a conversation about like, hey, why'd you change that way and I changed it this way? So yeah, I think that's that.
Perfect. And I hope that answered your second question there, Vaughn. And do we have any more before I wrap up the webinar? All right, David, if you could go ahead and stop sharing your screen and we'll wrap it up for you. Perfect. Thank you again, everybody, for joining, and thank you, David, for the really great content and the great webinar. I think Kyle and Mr. Jenkins really added to the creativity and funness of the webinar. I'm just going to wrap up the last few things, which of can't leave a webinar without letting you save the date. And before I touch on that, we will be sending up a follow-up email after the webinar that will include the free resources that David mentioned, as well as a recording of his webinar. So if there's anything you thought you missed or wanted to follow up on, we'll have that recorded for you on the Aten YouTube channel. We also will have a quick couple-minute survey to fill out to help us improve on these webinars for you guys. So please, if you can, take a few minutes to fill that out first. And then, of course, save the date. Our next webinar is taking place September 9th, and we are going to be focusing on setting up local Drupal development environments. And this webinar is going to be kind of different from our past webinars that we've been doing. We are going to be having a whole panel of Aten devs join us for 3 different lightning talks. It'll be Joel Steidel, Jordan Graham, and Travis Tomka. They're going to be talking a lot about Drupal development and different ways to set it up, as well as a new module that Travis Tomka has created called Project X. So we really hope to see you guys there. And thank you again for joining the webinar, and thank you, David. We really appreciate everything. And we hope to see you at the next one.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.